How did you do it?
I don't know. You did it.
Great, thank you. We had a rather inexplicable technological moment there, but it's all fine. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Mohsin Bhatt. I teach at the School of Law, Queen Mary, and we have been hosting Professor Philipp Dann the last few days. He's been here and very kind enough to come and talk to us. The last couple of days, he was teaching a masterclass with our students and also students who had come from across the country and from around the world on the question of coloniality and public law. I think this crowd doesn't require me to give a long introduction to Philip. We know that Professor Dann is a chair professor of public and comparative law in Humboldt in Berlin. He also has spent being a dean the last 6 months or so. So another last 3 months, and he'll be the dean for the next couple of years. He is among the leading figures of comparative constitutional law, and I think what makes Philip a remarkable figure is his very important advocacy for genuinely global or world constitutional studies, which is not just inclusive. It's not framed merely as a problem of inclusivity. It's framed as making comparative constitutional law epistemically a more robust discipline. And for those people who are interested in comparative constitutional law or public law more generally, whether even domestically, I think we see Professor Dann as a really important resource for us. And among other things, Professor Dann also has a background in law and development and law and political economy, which gives a very important dimension and sensibility to his work. For those people who attended the masterclass could see that as well. And perhaps finally, on a more personal note, I know Philip now for around 3 or 4 years. Had the great fortune of being part of a network of scholars comparing European Union and India as two continental-sized polities. And one of the things which I think marks Philip as a remarkable person in the room for us is his utter generosity and kindness to colleagues, particularly younger colleagues. He's a wonderful mentor to graduate students. And for those people who still remember those days or are in those days, you know how important that is. And I think that speaks volumes about him. And also, I think, reflects on the kind of work and his attitude towards his work, because one can't do genuinely good comparative work without having a great sensitivity and empathy towards stranger people, stranger places, in ways that make them our own and reveal something about ourselves. So thank you so much again, Philip, for being here with us, and we are really excited to hear you speak about coloniality and temporality.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mohsin, for this all too kind introduction. And also, of course, for the invitation to you and also to Tansel Chaudhry. Where is he? There he is. Yeah, so thanks a lot for having me. Thanks a lot for organizing the masterclass in the past 3 days, which was really exciting for me, intense, but also really useful. It worked. We are.
Oh, okay.
It's all good. Thanks. Yeah, so it was a real sort of pleasure also for me to do this. And the masterclass, as you just mentioned, was on colonial legacies in public law. And today, to some extent, I want to extend somehow some of the themes from that masterclass. But I want to sort of address them, or I want to come to them from a somewhat unusual angle, and that's the angle of time and thinking about time and temporality. So I will try to analyze to some extent how conceptions of time have shaped constitutional law and constitutional thought, and how those conceptions are ultimately, or conception of time are ultimately inextricably linked to the modern world and to colonialism. So I will try to somehow move and see how sort of time, temporality, and colonialism intersect. And I think there are very profound ways in which they intersect. So my argument is roughly the following. I think that even though time is somewhat an elusive or intangible kind of category, and even though it has been quite neglected actually in constitutional discourse for the longest times, now once you start looking, you will find plenty of discussions that actually turn on the question of time. When you think of climate change litigation, it's about a picture of the future. When you think about heritage laws or memory laws, it's about, or transitional justice, it's about the past. It's about how do we deal with the past. When you think about acceleration and technological innovation, it's about how do we keep up with speed, and how do we manage the incredible kind of acceleration of things in those areas. So, and to all of those, you can add now public law discussions and public law sort of attempted answers. And I think that the emergence of these questions and these temporal problems to some extent are no coincidence. They are, I think, connected to a much larger reconsideration of time and the understanding of time that we are used to. And more generally, perhaps, they are part of a general reappraisal of modernity itself and the modern understanding of time and temporality that's expressed in them. So, so to some extent, one can say that modern temporality is in crisis. And if you look into other disciplines, you will find plenty of discussion about exactly that sort of crisis of modern temporality across different fields. But it's not really just in other fields, but it has, I think, very profound implications also for our area, for constitutional and public law. And again, not by coincidence. The argument then follows is to say that modern temporality, or the modern understanding of time, emerged around the same time in the late 18th, early 19th century, when also modern written constitutions emerged. So our kind of, I mean, not the UK, but outside the UK, an understanding of constitutional law is profoundly shaped by a modern conception of written constitutions that intersects and actually builds on modern temporality. So we have a kind of sort of a temporal and a conceptual connection between modernity in its kind of temporal dimension and its constitutional dimension. But as I said earlier, we have somehow perhaps reached the end of our modern time and our confidence in that modern temporality. So the different crises that I mentioned, or the different problems that I mentioned, are perhaps just kind of indications that this connection between modern constitutionalism and modern temporality is getting strained, and it's getting kind of problematic. And so my argument goes on to say that's again no coincidence, because I think, and here I go again with many, I think, voices in the humanities, our modern temporality, or our modern understanding of time, has been or is in the process of being superseded by what I would call a new contemporary understanding of time, a contemporary temporality. And so what I try to observe and argue now is the connection between temporality and constitutionalism, and the shift from the modern to the contemporary. And perhaps to make this a little more kind of tangible, one thing perhaps where one can look is art, or art theory, because art theory has done this shift in the last 30 years, I would say. When you look around now and you look for museums, you will find museums of modern art, but you will find exactly also museums of contemporary art. And they also argue, or they are building on the assumption that something shifted in the later part of the 20th century. Something in the 80s, 70s, or 90s, somewhere around that time, something shifted where people said, okay, the modern era in art is over. Now it's a contemporary. I'm not saying it's exactly the same thing, but just to make this kind of sort of analogy. So that's the larger argument that I want to present here. And I want to go about this in three steps. I first want to explain what I mean by modern temporality, and explain a little more this connection between modern temporality and modern constitutions. Secondly, then comes the crisis. So I go into the crises and what is the contemporary understanding, what are the contemporary connections perhaps between a new understanding of time and their kind of impact in law. And third, finally, I want to ponder what are the broader consequences and also the potentials in terms of perhaps the chances that are connected to that shift from a modern to a contemporary temporality. And I will introduce what I've started to call reflexive globalization as one sort of outcome or one way to deal with this or with the opening that this shift has brought about. And in all these three steps, I will look in particular, or I will sort of try to sort of take a note of how does that connect to coloniality. So how has modern temporality and modern constitutional law, how has contemporary temporality and its law connected to, or what does it say about, how does it connect to colonialism, coloniality? Okay, so this is what I plan to do in the next roughly 25, 30 minutes. And before I begin with the first part, just very briefly, what do I mean by temporality? I've slipped this in a little bit already, but just to sort of make it more kind of explicit. My understanding when I talk of temporality, I mean I'm talking about the social and the societal understanding of time. So it's pretty much what is reflected in the political culture and in the everyday culture as an understanding of time. So it's pretty much how people make sense of time and how they relate to different areas of time. So this is my understanding of temporality. Okay, so let's start with the first step and the sort of the connection, and the co-emergence and the symbiosis of modern temporality and modern constitutions. And in order to understand that connection and reconstruct their connection, one has to go back, as I already said, into the starting points of this connection, and that's the late 18th century, the height perhaps of Enlightenment thinking, and a time of huge political reconsiderations, of course, and also, and that's important now, a reconfiguration and temporalization of the political language at that time. So at least that's when you go into history of ideas, that's what you read about, that those kind of years around, let's say, the French Revolution is also the time when, for the first time, people start to talk about sort of modern times, or the modern era, in German Neuzeit, and also in other languages. So, and what historians of political ideas then describe is that something shifted at the time from previously an understanding that was more directed towards the past and would more rely on let's say custom, on kind of traditions and the like, into something that was more forward looking. And what I try to characterize this normally in three or four elements. One is the new understanding of time was building on a break with the past. It was privileging the present. It was confident in the progress to be made in the future. And it was also confident in dealing with the felt acceleration of time, right? And so it basically, this new understanding of time implied a new agency of mankind. So it was basically an understanding that, okay, we can turn away from what our parents, grandparents, elders had done, but we can do what we think we should and want to do, and how we want to describe the future, and how we want to build the societies of the future. And that's exactly where modern constitutions come in, which, as I said, American Constitution, French Revolution and Declaration, Haitian Constitution in the early 19th century. About that time, we see this instrument of written constitutions emerging. And to some extent, you can say these constitutions put into practice or put into writing this understanding of time. They are almost perfect instruments to translate those ideas into practice. They basically encourage and sort of create sort of a new kind of script, which is authored by the people. So there's an agency of the generation of the people to do this. There is a there is a sort of a horizon looking into the future. There's kind of constitutions describe and proceduralize, temporalize how to go about legislation and the future. And they basically present the present government with, or the present generation with, the power to do so, right? So the constitutions, written constitutions, basically allow to sort of implement this idea of this modern idea of temporality. And then when you look in the 19th and 20th century, basically this symbiosis of constitutional form and modern temporality spreads around the globe. And this spread is surely in part a story of colonialism. So that kind of spread of the constitutional form as one form of legitimate government is really surely, in many cases, the one format which is the only format to legitimately claim that there is a new state and there's a new kind of beginning. So it surely is connected with colonial kind of domination. But it's not only, I would think, a story of colonialism. It's also that this modern temporality and this format of the constitution were just an sort of a format to claim ownership and to claim agency and to claim that one can actually break away from what was before. So to some extent, it was a pathway to being sort of agent, owned, and basically to be forward-looking into the future and describe the future. Anyway, so in the 20th century, of course, this kind of spreads further. The type of constitutional law changes. We see basically beginning with the Mexican Constitution, 1917, Russian Revolution, of course. We see a new type of a constitution emerging, which is much more material. So the constitutions, Weimar Constitution, they become much less kind of guarantist and much more materialized. They formulate more profound ideas. The Indian Constitution, 1950, is a high point of that. But what they don't do, they don't give up modern temporality. They are on there. So we have communist, we have social democratic, we have conservative, even conservative kind of constitutions. But they all somewhat play on this melody. They all are sort of progressing they're looking into the future. They are very kind of encouraging and empowering the present generation. So in that sense, I think there's a global spread. There's even a sort of modernity covers these different ideological camps in some way. This is not to say that there was no opposition. Obviously, starting with Edmund Burke and others, already the contemporaries of the French Revolution started to criticize that, right? There was a backlash. There was also opposition to this. But ultimately, and Gandhi probably is an interesting figure to think sort of what kind of temporality or temporal understanding would he have. I could now sort of draw onto German constitutional thinkers, Friedrich Julius Stahl and others, who would bring out very, very conservative kind of alternatives. So there is criticism, but this is sort of just I would say these are on the margins. And of course, there's also the common law, which has a totally different temporality, which is much more, I guess, based on looking into the past and building on the past. So I'm not saying that modern temporality and that model is all pervasive, but I think for many countries, for many constellations, it's very, very, very dominating. Okay, now when we look at this today, of course, as I said at the very beginning already, we are not so confident anymore in this type of understanding of the future and of time. And we see in many constellations and we see in many disciplines that there's an insecurity about the understanding of time. Obviously, our understanding of the future is not as optimistic or cannot be as optimistic as it used to be. And when we think about memory and I mentioned transitional justice, I think we are much less confident to just cut out the past, but are much more aware that somehow working through the past is important, and we can't just run away with it. And we perhaps also, anyway. So I think there's on the different elements of temporality have started to become unclear to us, or we have developed doubts. And so I would argue, but that's really just an argument, there's a crisis of time, and we perhaps can capture and conceptualize this crisis as a shift from the modern to the contemporary. So not just that there are different kind of elements of crisis, but that these different elements actually indicate a new type of temporality and a new understanding there. Because then, and I will briefly somehow go through these different elements. I will somehow try to describe how how the crisis has affected and played out in the different elements of the understanding of time. So one is our sort of the understanding of the past. As I said, in terms of the modern temporality was really one which was happy and proud and confident to break away from the past and to basically understand the old more as the whatever suffocating rules of commerce, of political life and the like, and something that one wants to cut away from and just say, okay, we are not bourgeois, we are not feudal anymore, we can be communists or we can be whatever we want to be, but we are not bound by those rules. I feel that when you look into how constitutional discourses or political discourses in many places play out nowadays, somehow the past is catching up with the present. As I said, perhaps the transitional justice is a very good example, but also memory or heritage culture. We are just much more prone nowadays to believe that in the past and preserving the past and in working through the past, we have a resource to do better and to perhaps become a better societies and to have a better kind of mutual understanding. So I think there's something when you look at this that seems to make sense, and that is not just political discourse, but as I said, cultural heritage law, memories laws, reparations. So you have many discussions that also turn on the law and ask about legal instruments of how to deal with it. So in that sense, the past, the breaking with the past, the understanding of the past seems to be somewhat different. Also, and even more obvious, is our conception of the future. As I said, perhaps the most important word in the or concept in the 18th century is Fortschritt, it's progress. It's the understanding that something better will come, right? We have the capacity, we have the agency to do sort of improve the world and in that sense somehow be optimistic about progress and progress in a political, in a cultural, in a technological, and even in moral terms. You know, if you work with Kant or something, it's almost like a moral kind of probability. That confidence, of course, is entirely shattered. I mean, and you now can pick your discussions or events of the 20th century, but that somehow with modernity, the world is getting better, hard to argue nowadays. And the criticism of this kind of modernity and the instrumentality of modernity, now you can pick your critique. I mean, I earlier mentioned more conservative ones, Edmund Burke, Stahl in the German, but you can also pick your left ones, Adorno, Horkheimer. That's exactly that kind of criticism, that there is something in modernity and there's a logic in sort of the instrumentality and rationality, which is not leading to progress, but which is also ultimately a very, very risky and dangerous weapon. And so that sort of the confidence in a progressive future is shattered, and we see now how in law this kind of discomfort is now tried to be operationalized. And perhaps again the best place to look at this is environmental law, and how do courts, how has environmental law since the 80s and now latest iteration in terms of climate change, how does that law develop basically risk assessment? What is now we can't build anything or without a risk assessment and looking into the future, not as the grand opening, but as a risky undertaking. And we want to have impact analysis. That's the word. So that's the second thing. So the future is not bright, not entirely bright. It's sometimes not at all bright, but it's something. And then the third element, just very briefly, I think one can also argue that while about the pace of time. So acceleration is an observation that's as old as modernity. The 19th century literature is full of descriptions of acceleration, so there's nothing new. But what is new when you look at the legal and constitutional debate is that acceleration is a real problem. So now we see how basically the speed of communication, of technological change is overwhelming the institutional system. And we see a lot of discussions basically which describe how, for example, legislators, but also courts also are just overwhelmed by the speed, and there seem to be not much of. I mean, there's ways to deal with this, but it's very difficult to deal with this. So there's a new, I think, sort of problematization of of acceleration and new instruments to deal with this. And here again, and then again comes a fourth aspect, and that's bringing us back to the question of coloniality. Because I think what somehow in the last couple of years or decades, since the 80s or so, has also become much clearer is the connection between time and space, between territory and temporality. And that's sort of starting with basically post-colonial critiques in different kind of registers. But what they are somehow pointing out is, of course, are contestations of modernity. And they are pointing out that in this modern temporality, there is an implicit universalism. It's not hidden necessarily, but it's implicit. It's not thematized. Modern temporality doesn't sort of factor in space. It's kind of universal. But what has been, I think, the product of much sort of critical thinking in post-colonial theory and beyond is to point out that it makes a difference how you think about time, whether you're in Berlin or in Brazzaville, or whether you're in Delhi or in somewhere. I mean, so it really is there's a connection between the sort of the one between time and territory, and the implicit universalism of modern temporality is, first of all, made explicit. And with that making it explicit, there's of course also the potential to critique it, right? And I think what I would say in contemporary times, in the contemporary temporality, we are mindful of the fact that there are and should be perhaps or could be different temporalities. And also good can come of different temporalities. It's not that there's one which is leading into the future and the other one is just stuck in the past, but there might be different sort of understandings of time that come from different cultures, from different regions and things. So I would say that this is part of it. Again, just one more sort of round here is the whole critique of development, and we talked about this in the class in the past days. The whole critique of developmentalism and the concept of development is, of course, also a historical critique, is a critique of the not yet that's built into every kind of conceptualizing of development. And it's basically a critique that says, okay, there is basically a modernization theory logic built into development, which sort of has the effect of setting one making basically a universal kind of assumption as if there is a developed and a non-developed, and that's a temporal kind of assumption. And by the way, this is not only a post-colonial critique, but it's a critique from different branches of critical studies, right? You can also, it's basically a critique that comes from the margins. You can also, as a feminist theorist or as a queer theorist, sort of start wondering and asking sort of what does that modern type of time, of modern temporality, what does that actually mean? Because it obviously it puts forward, it foregrounds one certain linear kind of understanding of time, which sort of pushes to the side other conceptions which have their own legitimacy, but were not kind of seen. Okay, so this is the second step. This is the kind of sort of the move into the crisis, and perhaps the move into the a contemporary understanding of time. And I think that one can not just observe this in different kind of discussions, but also see this in constitutional law and in constitutional or public law debates. So it's beyond that. Okay, so one then obviously after that crisis, one should think sort of what comes out of that. What's the what are the consequences, and what are also what are the potentials in this shift from the modern to the contemporary. And here is what I would argue. There is a very kind of, there's a potential for productive kind of dimension in this shift, and this is what I would call what I would say that there's an opening for a more reflexive global rethinking of the vocabulary of political and constitutional thought, and the potential for reflexive globalization, as I would call it. And I want to outline three different potentials, so three different ways in which this potential might kind of be open. So one is, I think that thinking about time and factoring in time in our constitutional thought might help us to connect legal thought to other disciplines. Lawyers are often very happy to stick to themselves, work in doctrine and work in sort of their own kind of fields, and that's also good and important in many ways, but there are also, of course, great benefits. And I think here there would be a huge benefit in sort of connecting two discussions in the humanities and social sciences. There's actually a strange disconnect between in the law, in thinking about time. So what we definitely have is a lot of thinking about law in time. Historical work is about how has law evolved sort of in time. What we don't have is thinking about time in law, right? So how is law actually utilizing time, right? How is law making use of certain temporal kind of dynamics and the like? And I think there's a gap there. There's a void which is really interesting to fill. And I think in this kind of sort of shift from a perspective on the territory, which has always been very much at the forefront or in the legal mind, borders, territories, and the like. There is a potential shift from the territory to the temporality, and there's potential in there. The second potential that I see, or the second kind of positive outcome here, is to historicize constitutionalism, and by thinking about time and modern temporality, and especially somehow to reflect about modernity in law. Somehow there seems to be there's easily in doctrinal work and also in other more conceptual works a reification of constitutional concepts. Often concepts are somehow seen without their kind of context and somehow given an historical kind of need. And I think there's a need to sort of de-reify, basically contextualize concepts. And one of the most important, I think, things that or sort of agenda points that we have is to realize and to scrutinize to what extent are the concepts that we are working with concepts that are modern and therefore part of the modern law kind of world, and what can be non-modern or postmodern, if you want, or something. But basically to wonder sort of and to investigate sort of to what extent is this something particular that has emerged in the modern era, which I would say 1750 to whatever, 1950, somehow in that time, which is kind of part of that. And thinking about temporality, as I just described, might be a way to have in there. And I think there's a lot of kind of potential in that type of historicizing, or perhaps, to modify one famous title, provincialized modernity. To realize that modernity is not, it's not universal per se, but there was something before, and there was something next to it, and there was something after it. And so to some extent provincialize and realize that this is one particular phase in the history of law and in the use and making of law, but not law itself. It's not the thing. There is always a context, right? And so I think this can help, and this can also help in sort of making this a more sort of a more kind of global exercise. And that's again now linking it back to the question of coloniality. I think we have somehow there is a sort of a deficit in legal thought or constitutional thought in reflecting on south-north dimensions and dynamics of modernity and modern constitutional law. And again, I think we can take a page from the book of the humanities, which has discussed that dynamic extensively and has contrasted different kind of understandings of south-north dynamics in modernity. And just very briefly, I mean, one could be, of course, is modernization theory, and would be a conceptualization going back to Hegel and Marx and Hegel and Weber and stuff, which basically puts Europe first and then the rest of the world sort of afterwards, right? So it's concepts are developed in the West and then they are kind of spread around. So that's a modernization theory type of argument. The counter argument would be multiple modernities, right? Shmuel Eisenstadt and Karl Jaspers and the like, who would have argued that no, it's not that first in the West and then in the rest, but there is a sort of an emergence of profound understandings about the human mind and the like, which emerge roughly at the same time. And which are somehow sort of parallel in different regions of the world. And then thirdly, there is the thinking about not modernities as modernization theory or sort of multiple modernities, but perhaps entangled modernities, thinking more about sort of the emergence of concepts which is neither just consecutive or parallel, but somehow interlinked. And there is a back and forth, and there's a one only sort of is possible with the other. And now this somehow tapping into this understanding of modern, or these kind of discussions about modernity, and shifting them and applying them to constitutional law and constitutional history could be really helpful, and in kind of provincializing modernity and in understanding what is particular about modern law and the modern also temporal understanding and the way that this is then conceiving of South-North and global kind of relations. Okay, last point, and then I'm coming to the end. Last point, or the third kind of potential that I would see in this rethinking of constitutional law through a temporal perspective and through temporality is I think that this can really contribute to the pluralization of our constitutional vocabulary and to what I have started to call reflexive globalization. So I think there is the chance now to renegotiate the vocabulary of constitutional law beyond just sort of or in a truly mutual way. And I think this has two elements. One is that what we can observe in the last roughly 10, 15 years, I think, in constitutional law scholarship is a much bigger attention to non-Western constitutional experiences across the board, right? So what's often called the varieties of constitutionalism. You have by now really, I mean, sort of work on even socialist constitutionalism again, but also Buddhist, Asian, African. It's there are regional sortings, there are more ideological sortings, but you have a much broader kind of comparative analysis of constitutional law, which is not immediately saying that whatever is not liberal is deficient, right? Because that's what we had in the 1990s and 2000s, that often what goes beyond the liberal kind of model is then seen as somewhat deficient. I think by now we have reached a moment where we have more kind of attention. And through that attention and through that scholarship, we have the ability to engage with the vocabulary, the concepts from different reasons. And the second element that comes into this is, of course, knowing what we are doing. And that's what I mean by reflexivity, in the sense that we realize that we provincialize liberalism, perhaps, or modernity, and somehow we realize by looking at these different varieties, not just only that there's a value in itself to just have the knowledge of this, but there's also a methodological kind of consciousness that, okay, we are doing this as whatever, as Europeans looking somewhere, as Indians looking somewhere, as whoever is doing this, right? And then one can ask, and that's perhaps something for the discussion later on, one can ask sort of, where does this lead to? How does that connect to the question of the universal or the particular? Is this only one direction possible, or only the other? And what are the kind of the formats that might be possible here? Okay, I'm coming to the end, and just very, very briefly. So I think really time is and temporality is just a very fascinating and productive angle. I think once we sort of put on this lens and look at law in different areas, actually, we see many more things. So in itself, it seems to be a fascinating and productive kind of question to ask. But it seems, secondly, especially productive if you then combine this with other questions from the margins and from, or what used to be conceived or made the margins, right? When you somehow ask this sort of, how does that temporality, how does the temporal thinking then now connect to or look from, let's say, a feminist or a Southern perspective? And then I think once you factor this in, you see that there is a lot of kind of, there are alternatives and there are differences and there are potentials for comparison and for further development. And I think that then is the opening to reflexive globalization, in the sense that one can rethink and perhaps reformulate the vocabulary in which we do constitutional law and constitutional theory. Thank you very much.
Well, I was hoping that, thank you so much, Philip. We have a round of questions. I was hoping that this would work, but I'm not sure. Maybe it is working. I'm not sure. Should we collect a few
definitely.
questions at a time, and then maybe I'll pass this along. Yeah, and I'll go through. Yeah, you go first.
Okay. Thank you so much, Philip. This was very rich and illuminating. But I want to know precisely what contemporary temporality, what is its relationship, or what is its attitude and orientation towards modernity? Is it anti-modern, non-modern, or post-modern? And if you disavow modernity, how do you really create space for emancipatory and progressive politics? Now, rather than contemporary versus modern temporality, my reading of time would be a scientific way of reading it and a philosophical way of thinking about it. Scientific way is rather entirely very spatial. So time is the time that the Earth takes to complete one revolution around the sun. And that, in a way, translates into law. Law is, as we know from Schmidt, a very spatial concept. So law is a nomos, law is a land grab, law is a land taking. In contrast, with philosophy, it's only Bergson, and in India, you mentioned Gandhi. It's interesting that for Gandhi, God is truth. But I would also refer here to Muhammad Iqbal, the South Asian poet philosopher, for whom God is time. And what time does in Iqbal's philosophy is that it brings past, present, and future together. And it's very like analogizing it with the Islamic prayer. Like you pray 5 times a day in the morning. It's a kind of a rupture. You rather than being asleep, it's a rupture. You wake up and pray. In the afternoon, rather than working, it's a rupture from your daily routine. You go and pray. In the evening, rather than spending time with your family, you go and pray. So, this is a kind of a law which is taking temporality seriously, and it is in a kind of way introducing a rupture which creates the conditions of possibility for freedom and emancipation. So my point is that is there a problem over here with modern temporality itself, or is there a problem over here that you are identifying is one with individual or self-centered liberal constitutionalism? I mean, so in Iqbal, there would be this engagement with the environment and the problem of the Anthropocene, where you would say that, okay, you think of man or the human subject as a kind of a trustee, which is responsible to kind of engage with the earth or the universe around them in responsible ways. But at the same time, it is also an agent which, through the law that temporality introduces, is also an agent of freedom. So that's my, modern relationship with modernity. And is there a problem with temporality, or modern temporality, or liberal constitution?
Do you want to take a couple of questions?
Yeah, I mean, let's take one or two more, and then whatever you.
I'll project, it's fine. My question is, I guess, what you pointed out, the relationship between time and space, and linking it to what you were saying at the end of this more reflexive globalization, more reflexive understanding of constitutional law. I guess my question is, scholars from the global south studying constitutional law in the global north, or Europeans studying, the margins. My question is, so often the case studies turn around specific thematic areas. It'll be India on basic structure doctrine, South Africa on socioeconomic rights. Or you'll sit in a UK constitutional theory class, and your professor will point to you and say, "You South African, tell me why transformative constitutionalism makes any sense." And I guess my question is, how do we take this trend that you've highlighted, a move towards the margins, etc.? How do you take that so that it is not just the marginal voices of scholars from the global south or a rare European scholar thinking about colonialism, and make it the mainstream without, I don't know, it often feels like being in that environment can feel quite feel very patronized, and often in classes that are specifically about coloniality or about the global south, the only people who are there are people from the global south, people who are from former colonies. And I'm wondering, how do we make that move so that it is not just a turn from the north to the south, but also a recognition by scholars in the north that there is value in the contributions of the south.
Take one more and then go back to Philip. I saw Tansi's hand. I'm looking around. You can keep raising hands. Tansi, do you want to go first?
Yeah. So, Philip, I'm trying to think about whether or not you are periodizing modern temporality and contemporary temporality. And because later you talk about how we might provincialize modern time, and it seems to me that's kind of more instructive, because what one might argue that even modern time, if we characterize it as a detachment from the past and an optimism about an unknowable future from which there are loads of possibilities. At the same time, capitalism, and certainly if we think about how Weber understands modernity capitalism, is actually about a stabilization of the future. And a stabilization of the future seems like an attempt to know and certainize the future. So maybe it's a much more kind of teleological reading of the future, rather than it being one of possibilities. And even in the kind of, I also think about different political projects and how they read and understand time. So thinking about kind of reparations as a kind of modern political project is about some kind of attachment to the past. Modi's project is at the same time a kind of revivalism, but one of his popular slogans is about good days are coming. So there's an optimism about the future. And so I want you to maybe explain whether or not what you're doing is periodizing modern temporality and contemporary temporality. And whether or not provincializing time can maybe complicate this periodization and actually say that there are different temporalities that are adjacent to one another at the same kind of historical moment. If that makes sense.
Great. Yeah. Thanks a lot. I mean, really a lot to think about. So first of all, Maurice, yeah, thanks a lot. I mean, so what's the relation between the modern and the contemporary, and is the contemporary postmodern or non-modern or pre whatever, and then your own kind of model, and is the modern the liberal. So I mean, first of all, I think I wouldn't at all argue that the modern is gone. There's an overlap. There's a lot of modern going on, and the modern world is not gone at all. But what I think there is kind of certain elements of the modern and of the modern temporality are in crisis. That's how I would put it, and therefore there is kind of not an entire shift, but there's a problematization. So in that sense, I think it's not easily captured as the non-modern or the postmodern. It's somewhat overlapping and taking parts in, and others not. So it's in that sense it's not a it's these are ideal types perhaps, but they are not exclusive. They're not mutually exclusive, but they one builds on the other. But I think also about your scientific versus philosophical, I have to really chew on that longer. What I can say is that I don't think that the modern temporality is only the a part of liberal constitutionalism. I think that doesn't really. I thought that in the beginning. I thought that liberal constitutionalism is kind of the one biggest kind of proponent and model in which modern temporality plays out. But when then I started to look also in other kind of ideological corners, I realized that the communist kind of ideas are exactly modern. It's a very, very modern kind of type. It's a very kind of thinking into the future, planning the future, having an idea of progress. It's an idea of where one wants to go. So I think it's not that it's not that I don't think modern and liberal are kind of identical, but I think there's more in the modern package than the liberal. So in that sense, I think it's a little it's going further, even though, of course, by now, of course, the liberal constitutional model is perhaps the dominant and the hegemonic, or was at least, and so we are seeing that mostly, and we are seeing this also because there is an element of modern temporality in capitalism and its kind of mechanisms, which is of course extremely dominant, and so yeah. But I wouldn't say that. It seems to me that in terms of constitutional temporalities, the modern type features, modern temporality features in the liberal and in others as well. And then on your question, sort of how to move away from patronizing, basically, or basically sort of letting the margins quickly speak in class and then move on, or ignore, or like, I mean, that's exactly the of course part of the problem. But I'm actually quite confident or optimistic in that way that we are past that stage, or we are slowly moving out of that space, out of that stage. Because my sense is that in the moment that we realize how much there is to discover in other constitutional places and constitutional experiences, we also realize how much to gain, we in the sense of Europeans now, and how much there is in the exchange, and not just the South as the kind of case material to build on theory, but to engage in the theoretical sort of discussions with those from other areas. And it was mentioned earlier. So my engagement with Indian scholars, constitutional scholars, was exactly that. I was just extremely fascinated by the theorizing that also comes from the other places. And then, or as we discussed in this class, there are, when you think about constituent moments, founding moments, or when you think about minorities, or when you think about other aspects, there's so much where you, once you start sort of integrating the experiences from other places, that upends the conceptual vocabulary, that you have to somehow deal with this sort of on one level. So I think I mean, obviously it takes time, and it's not everything is good at all, but I think there is a moment, and my sense is that also in current scholarship, a lot of people realizing that there is this kind of opening and that there's this shift. But yeah, of course, this is as for some people the glass is half empty, and half for others it's half full. For me, in that sense, it keeps getting fuller. Yeah. Tanzel, yeah, I mean, perfect. I mean, this is really great hearing someone rephrase certain kind of sort of formulations and learn from them. So I think it's great how you put it. Perhaps the provincializing is more productive than periodizing or putting periods. I think that's a really interesting observation. And to some extent, of course, it says, okay, perhaps space is more helpful than time, if you want, or yeah. Could be. I mean, it's as I said. I mean, to some extent, I mean, it's a little provocative, of course, to describe these two temporal models, and to, I mean, they're made up ultimately, right? I mean, they're just ideas, and let's see how people will react and whether it catches on. For me, I thought there is a lot to learn from thinking through these types and these ideal types. Which coincides with certain times. And in that sense, I felt that there is a certain period which I can capture well with that. And through that periodization, move to provincialization. So to some extent, one was an instrument to get to the other somehow. So, or one helped me see the other. And so I think this kind of provincializing modernity idea is part of that, right? I mean, so that in thinking about time, we get a better understanding of space. So yeah, how that connects to concrete political movements, I don't know. And it's really confusing, and it's really kind of mingled and overlapping. That's why, I mean, my first answer to Mui is, I mean, I don't think that it's clearly this or that, and especially these nativist kind of movements like Modi or so, they play with the past, but they also sort of allude to the future, right? They do somehow both in a very confusing way. So I wouldn't want to go into that, because I can't really place them well. But I think your question, sort of how does periodization, so thinking about the historical sequence and the space, and in the sense of provincializing, how they relate, I think that's really very, very helpful. And but I can't, I mean, fully answer this yet, but it's great. Yeah.
I had a question as well. I'll just pause. I think let's start with you, then that, and if there's a bit of time, I'll throw in a very short question, and then we'll do another.
Thank you for listening. I was just wondering, when you talked about, like, when you referenced art to talk about this contemporary time, you kind of described the contemporary time that treated as a mosaic of many different ways of seeing time, like this composition of ways of seeing time. But I see
Brilliance Audio presents the weirdest people in the world. Peculiar and particularly personal.
Oh, sorry.
That's
That was
okay.
very appropriate.
That's us.
That I can formulate better. But the movement I see, at least in art theory, it's exactly the opposite, in the sense of, like, until modern art, until, I don't know, Dadaism, we were having a dialogue with the past all the time. So we were criticizing old schools of art and stuff, and we were objectifying art in terms of, like, the relationship with art was a subject-object relationship. So you could just bring a canvas and an idea, and that would be considered art. But contemporary art is just the opposite. Is for me at least in Hal Foster, that's very clear in the art theory critique, that the contemporary time in art is actually the suspension of time and the art of now. So it's actually putting the art observer in confrontation with materiality and with the real, what we don't want to see. So it's not more about talking theoretically what what the time of the new art is going to bring, because we got to the limit of this. But it's actually, I bring you my, I don't know, my piece of clothes full of blood, and then you can think about femininity, whatever. So it's bringing materiality to suspend time. And actually, I think the turn in law to think about a contemporary time in law would actually be suspend time and think about a politics of now, and not only theorize anymore like how can we treat different ways of dealing with time, but time is not a category anymore. I think so. I'm kind of skeptical in the sense that I think time is so abstract that it's not bringing power to the left. So in a way, we can like either fetishize time, or we can just treat it as a necessary dead category for law, I think. Yeah, so I wanted to do this point.
Thank you, President, for the inspiration master bench. I want to ask about the potential tension might be in between temporality and the voice from the self or the margin. Because I was thinking about John Polk's classical works, which like really bring the idea of temporality within the history of writing in British history context. And he kind of reviving the politics of historiography, but mostly like republicanism, like Machiavellian movements. See the travel of idea of republicanism, which is like revival of the ancient time. But the problem, I think, for one year side, beside there is some constitutional moment when you see different school of thought or idea are competing with each other. For other times, using the method of history ideas usually make us to focus on really dominant language condition or dominant idea of soul which prevailing within the society. And that's made me wonder, like, would that be possible tension with, like, if we want to have an emancipatory effect of, like, focus on the voice from itself, or the voice from the people who is marginalized by the mental society, whether there would be a little bit problematic in terms of knowledge.
I take the liberty of asking a question and then go back to you. I guess sort of partly connected to a couple of questions earlier. I was wondering whether you would reflect a bit more on contemporary authoritarian constitutional politics from the prism of temporality. Because obviously, as Tanzil said, right, temporality is so central to how right-wing authoritarian conception of politics is presented to the world, not just Modi or Erdogan, but when Trump says "Make America Great Again," it sort of is a very strong temporal point. But at the core of it, and while I was listening to you, I realized that "Make America Great Again" is not only a certain introduction of temporality, but also about which people have temporality, which people have histories. And that reminds me of the post-colonial critique of history itself. Because it reminds me of Ashish Nandi's point that the colonial project was fundamentally about making a claim that history is fundamental to civilization. And there are certain peoples who never had a past. So it was, in a sense, introduction of temporal conceptions of politics to understand political subjectivity itself, which I think is a far greater critique of temporality itself. And I guess what Nandi would say is perhaps Gandhi's radical critique was not just of being skeptical about utopias, but about the project of utopias, because that is fundamental to temporality and how we run politics itself. Now, I may or may not be sympathetic to that, but it seems that there is that connection which repeats constantly in contemporary times as well. So perhaps a provocative question would be, is there law, can there or should there be law outside temporality itself?
Okay. um, Okay. Yeah, let's start with Isidore. Art theory. Look, I mean, obviously, I'm not an art historian and have to read up on this and understand better. But to some extent, I thought that when you were coming to the contemporary art and how the contemporary art kind of sort of describes the world or what it does, and what you describe as the suspension of time in basically the move away from the material, perhaps, and the suspension of time. That's exactly what I'm trying to point to. I mean, it's you can only suspend time when you realize that you are in time. You can only start kind of making assumptions about this or that when you know that you have a certain temporal model that you're following. My observation about constitutional law and constitutional theory is that we don't think about time. Go into any constitutional law book and look for how it treats time. It's just a non-topic. And that's the very, very odd observation. I mean, it's shifting, it's changing. Now you find books, edited volumes in the last 5 years about temporality. But if you go further back, you have always history, right? You have always law in time, but you have very, very little thinking about time in law and how constitutions really work with time. You have a little bit here and there, but it's really rare. I mean, it's coming in the last, let's say, 10, 15 years. So that's what I'm saying. So I'm not saying that the contemporary is as such a conclusive new vision, perhaps, of time. I'd say that it's overlapping with the modern, and it's adding, and it's crisis, and this and that. But what I think is that, or what I'm observing is that we start thinking about what time does in law, and that's the point. And then you can mobilize it for different kind of ways and for different projects, right? You can make it a left project or a right project or however you want to then categorize it. But first of all, you have to understand, okay, we are working with time. Very, very fascinating. Go into migration law. Migration law in the last 4 or 5 years has started to think about how is actually the governance of migration structured in time. It's a new, almost, I think, I mean, perhaps I'm ignorant, but when I talked with migration lawyer, that's also their observation. It's different. And now we start realizing about all these kind of periodization. You have to live for 5 years before. You have to wait for that. You have to do this or that in time. So there's temporal boundaries, not just territorial boundaries, but we start to realize how temporal kind of instruments are used in law to govern, right, in different ways. So I think that's my broader point, first of all, to say, okay, there is a gap in legal discourse, in constitutional thinking about what time is doing in law and how law is using time. And then you can, of course, then you can start about thinking sort of how are certain projects connected in their thing. But so to some extent, so that would be my first step. And then I come to the point with Mohsen in a moment. But so I think it starts a little earlier. Just okay, perhaps I go straight to this. The MAGA, the sort of who is basically which people have voice and who are sort of agents of perhaps sort of thinking about time. And I think, I mean, yeah, I mean, but look, I mean, look, it's also still a field, of course, in which I start to sort of try to understand. I think there is, of course, Hegel's trap, right? I mean, there is Hegel's trap in what you repeated, right? In the sense of there is a, and that's exactly in the early 19th century, late 18th, early 19th century. There's a beginning of thinking about time and history and agency of people in time and history. And now comes this Southwest German dude, actually working at Humboldt University, Hegel, and he has this. He tries to make sense of the evolution of history and the agency of different kind of peoples and regions, and he presents this idea that there are certain regions and certain cultures which have no history, famously the Indians, and then others who start a certain kind of to conceive parts of it. And of course, in his reading, then the ultimate kind of fulfillment are Germans, are Prussians, who then, and who basically, I mean, this is very, very short and shortcut, but of course, so that in a way, he sees that a full engagement with sort of organization of society and agency only comes in kind of the modern times in societies which have a fully developed kind of statehood and the like. So that's what how Hegel puts it. But I think Hegel is just one voice, and we know enough to say that Hegel was most likely very, very wrong. I mean, he was wrong, right? I mean, he was very influential in presenting this kind of philosophy of history and philosophy of using time and history, but he was wrong. And so in a way, I feel that it is a trap to somehow think that in that line of thinking, we should go further. And that's why I mentioned these three different models of seeing the history. One is modernization theory, and I would say that Hegel is an early step of modernization theory. But we also have Karl Jaspers and Shmuel Eisenstadt and others who thought about multiple modernities and the actual era and others. So they're counter kind of observations. And so there, I think you have different kind of conceptions of which people have historical and temporal agency. And the point would be now to say we have to engage with these different kind of conceptions and understand them, and then even perhaps translate them or see to what extent they can be used for constitutional and political thought, or even constitutional and political projects, right? And I think that somehow I mean, we are lacking behind the political theory, but I think there are a couple of books now which are actually turning attention to especially South Asian and Chinese thought on time and their intersection of those conceptions and politics, pretty much. But it's very early. I'm not saying that there's a large kind of body of work, but I see people, Dilip Menon and others, who are doing this. And so I just that's what I would think, that we have to sort of study those, and then we have perhaps alternatives to the modern conception and other kind of sort of models that question the linearity and question the progressive idea and the like. And once we see that, then we have a kind of sort of broader picture. So I don't think law can be out of time. We're always in time. There's no suspension of time. Time just, I mean, there's a scientific kind of ongoing of time, and we always think of time. I mean, we can't take ourselves out of that. We can't take ourselves out of history. We are just in it. The question is, how do we conceptualize it? How do we conceptualize the past and the future? So, but I think we are in law. We are pretty much at the beginning of realizing sort of what is it that we think about time, how as a society, first of all, generally, and then how do we use this in law? I think we are in the process. It's just starting, but I don't think we can take us out. And when Maga makes or Modi make references to the past as a project for the future, then we have to study that, and we have to point this out, and we have to see that these are nostalgic and surreal kind of conceptions, and point out those kind of contradictions also. But it's important, I think, to have that type of kind of analysis to understand and critique them ultimately, right? So it's in a way, but I surely wouldn't say that thinking about temporality is a left-wing project. I mean, happily so, if we can use it for left politics, but I wouldn't infuse left or right kind of questions now into this. First of all, I think it's an analytical kind of task. I mean, to first of all understand how things work, and then of course also to then sort of criticize and to counter and to resist, or however you want to then move on to it. But in the beginning, I would say it's an analytical thing to realize. Okay, and then your question on the tension between perhaps temporality and also Southern voices. I mean, perhaps I misunderstood you, but I don't think that we see now kind of a shift from a dominance of Northern to perhaps a dominance of Southern voices. And what I see that is that you always have, as you described, you always have different camps of schools thinking about the law and making sort of propositions for constitutional concepts, and in different kind of registers and in different kind of political kind of leanings, and also from different places. But the whole point is just to broaden the, let's say, the choir, and to broaden the arena of people who are taking part in the discussion. And I think that's what I would observe, that we see a broadening of this kind of the people who have voice, and I think that one way to make clear that we should have that opening is to think about time, because that kind of alerts us to sort of deficiency, right? So yeah, that direction.
I'm going to be horribly rude. As you know, we have exceeded time. So I need to thank Philipp. Luckily, we'll be around for another 5-10 minutes, so you can ask Philipp questions after the session is over, which is now. Thank you so much.
Thank you.